When I first bought the farmland, I didn't see it as just property. I saw it as a legacy, something that spanned generations and would outlast me. A stretch of rolling 3,200 acres that had been in my family line for over a century, where my grandfather had broken his back sowing wheat, where my father had driven rusted tractors through storms and summers, and where I had grown up learning to mend fences, herd cattle, and bid. Looking for ways out of the countryside, I had doubled down, invested in irrigation systems, restored the barns, laid down new fencing, and even leased out small sections for local ranchers who needed grazing space. Because to me, this land wasn't just about crops or livestock, it was about history, stability, and the unshakable truth that no one could take it away. Or so I thought, until the day I discovered that the local homeowners ASO, nicknamed Karen behind her back, had somehow managed to file fraudulent paperwork and sell large swaths of my land right from under me. An audacious crime that would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous, because suddenly, without my permission, their development project had bulldozers lined up, surveyors hammering stakes into my fields, and contractors pouring foundations where I had once grazed cattle. And as I stood there, on my property, I knew instantly that I wasn't going to let this pass quietly, because if there was one thing I had more of than money, it was patience, legal knowledge, and the stubbornness inherited from generations of farmers who never let anyone push them off their land. And I made up my mind right then. If they thought they could steal from me, I would make sure to strip them bare in ways they couldn't even imagine, legally, decisively, as sure crossing paths with me. And the best part was, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Because while I might have looked like a quiet rancher, I was also a licensed attorney who had built his practice around land and property law, a fact I kept under wraps most of the time, but a weapon I was ready to unleash. And the thought of using the very system they had tried to cheat against them sent a wave of cold, calculating satisfaction through me. Fight. It was going to be a war they couldn't win. The first step I took was not to storm into their so-called community office or start yelling at the contractors who were hammering down stakes into the soil that my grandfather had bled over. No, I knew better than to let rage dictate my moves, because anger might give me satisfaction in the moment, but it wouldn't win me the war. And wars, especially those fought in the shadows of property law, contracts, and fraudulent filings, are what one tracts. And fraudulent filings are one more that outlast your enemy's ability to keep fighting. So instead, I quietly pulled back into my farmhouse, poured myself a strong black coffee, and started gathering every single deed, plat map, and historic record that tied me to this land. And there was a mountain of it, because unlike most people, I had inherited not just the property, but the meticulous paper trail left behind by 3 generations of farmers who, suspicious of three generations of farmers, who, suspicious of cabinets. And as I sifted through the stack, I found exactly what I needed. Survey maps dating back nearly a century, mineral rights deeds, water use agreements, and most importantly, the most recent title certification issued by the county clerk less than 6 months ago, which clearly marked me as the sole and rightful owner of the entire 3,200 acres, free and clear of liens, easements, or encumbrances, which had committed not only civil fraud, but potentially a felony. And in that moment, I smiled, because the HOA might have thought of me as some simple farmer with dirt on his boots, but what they didn't know was that I had been a trial lawyer in my younger years, and not just any lawyer. I had specialized in land disputes, eminent domain cases, and fraudulent conveyances, so I knew the game better than they did, and I had the patience to let the formality. A favor from an old friend at the recorder's office, a woman who owed me for representing her pro bono when her family almost lost their ranch a decade ago, and within 24 hours she dug up the fraudulent transfer deeds filed by the HOA's legal counsel. And the beauty of it was, they weren't even smart about it. They used boilerplate contracts, forged signatures that didn't even come close to matching mine, and claimed notarization, which meant not only could I prove fraud, but I could make it criminal. And while most people might have run to the sheriff immediately, I held back because I wanted the HOA to keep digging their hole, pouring money into building on land they didn't own, investing every dollar they had into a development that was destined to collapse once I lowered the boom. And so I played dumb, acted like the bewildered landowner who wasn't sure what his rights were, that tore up my topsoil, every concrete truck that dumped its load, every home they framed on my land without my permission, and by the time a month had passed, there were over 60 houses half built on my acreage, every one of them nothing more than ticking time bombs of liability for the HOA. Because not only were they built without title, they were built without valid permits, since the permits relied on the fraudulent deeds, which meant when and the kicker, every family that had already bought into these houses through the HOA's crooked scheme would turn their fury not on me, but on the very board that had conned them, because as the true landowner, I was untouchable, and the HOA was the one that had promised what it couldn't deliver. And while all this unfolded, I quietly began drafting my lawsuit, a massive civil action alleging fraud, trespass, unjust enrichment, conversion, and racketeering and read like a death sentence for their entire organization. And to make matters worse for them, I didn't just stop at civil filings because I also prepared a package for the county prosecutor, the state attorney general, and even the FBI. Because fraudulent property filings that cross state or federal lines can qualify as wire fraud and racketeering under RICO statutes. And nothing makes bureaucrats hungrier than the scent of a high-pro freer, than the scent of a high-pro freer, than the scent of a high-pro free. Done. I wasn't just holding the HOA accountable, I was setting them up to be publicly eviscerated, stripped of everything, and maybe even jailed. And the beauty was, they had no idea the storm was coming. Because while I worked, they strutted around my land in golf carts, giving tours to prospective buyers, bragging about their exclusive lakeside development, completely oblivious to the fact that I was shadowing them with a shadowing them with a dro. Property they didn't own, stacking up evidence like hay bales in a barn. And the longer I watched, the more brazen they became, with Karen herself, the self-proclaimed HOA queen, telling reporters that they had partnered with a local landowner, me, apparently, to create a once-in-a-lifetime housing community. And when I saw her face on the evening news lying through her teeth, I laughed so hard, I nearly spilled my drink, because I knew she had. That could be used against her in court. Proof that the fraud wasn't some clerical error, but a deliberate, knowing scheme. And so I waited like a hunter in a blind, biding my time until every one of their houses, every driveway, every road they carved into my land became evidence of their own undoing. Because when I struck, I wanted it to be so devastating, so complete, that the HOA would never recover. And little did they know the HOA would never recover. And little did they know the HOA would never recover. And little did they know the HOA turned to dust beneath them. The morning I decided to finally pull the trigger on the lawsuit was one of those crisp fall days when the air bites a little at your skin and the leaves crackle under your boots. And as I walked across my porch with a mug of coffee in hand, I could see the silhouettes of half-finished houses rising like ugly skeletons against the horizon of my farmland, each one a monument to the arrogance of Karen and her HOA board. And I knew the time had come to HOA board. And I knew the time had come to HOA board. And I knew the time had come to HOA board. Desk opened the manila folder that had grown so fat it barely closed, and slid my lawsuit across the table to my attorney friend Mark, who had once been my fiercest courtroom rival but had grown into one of my closest allies after years of professional respect turned into friendship. And when he finished reading the 140-page complaint I had drafted, he leaned back in his chair, let out a low whistle, and said, "You were meant for your whistle," and said, "You wrote," because that was the whole point. I wasn't filing to negotiate. I wasn't filing to scare them into a settlement. I was filing to destroy them utterly, to strip every dollar, every privilege, and every illusion of control from that HOA until nothing remained but the ashes of their arrogance. So Mark took my draft, polished it with a few procedural flourishes, and by the following Monday, we walked into the county courthouse with a box of filing. The fuse was lit. the clock ticking toward the explosion that the HOA could neither dodge nor defuse, because within 48 hours, every member of their board was served with papers accusing them of fraud, trespass, conspiracy, conversion, and racketeering. And when the news broke, it spread like wildfire through the community, because the lawsuit wasn't just against the HOA as some vague entity. I had named Karen, her treasurer, her SEP, filed their deeds, each one personally liable, each one staring down the barrel of potential ruin, and the reaction was immediate. Phone calls lit up my lawyer's office, emails poured in, reporters camped outside Karen's house, and homeowners who had sunk their savings into the HOA's promises started demanding answers. But instead of calming the storm, Karen doubled down, holding a press conference on the steps of one of the half-finished homes. So, perfect fake smile, declaring that my lawsuit was baseless and that I was a bitter farmer clinging to outdated land, and that the HOA had every legal right to the property. But as she spoke, I stood across the road with a drone buzzing above us, filming everything, because every word she said was another nail in her coffin, another piece of evidence that proved intent. And when she claimed, on camera, that I had signed over rights which with a 10 nearly laughed out loud, because I knew she had just committed libel and fraud in one sentence. And the cameras caught my grin as I sipped my coffee like I was watching a comedy show, which in a way I was, because the HOA didn't realize that with every denial, every arrogant proclamation, they were building the very case I would use to crush them. And sure enough, within a week of filing, the judge granted my request for an injunction, freezing all conniving. The judge granted my request for an injunction, freezing all kike for an injunction, freezing all kike old for an injunction. 60 houses they'd started building had to stop mid-frame. Contractors walked off the job, machinery sat idle in fields, and the investors who had pumped money into the project began to panic, calling emergency meetings, whispering about pulling out, because suddenly the can't-miss development looked like a scam teetering on collapse. And as panic spread, I released the next move in my playbook, the criminal referral package, which I did. Attorney General's office and the local FBI field office, each one a thick binder of evidence showing forged signatures, fake notary stamps, wire transfers, and recorded footage of Karen and her cronies selling what they didn't own. And when the assistant U.S. attorney read through it, she called me within 2 days and said, "This is one of the cleanest fraud cases I've seen in years. We're very interested." And that was when I knew the HOA's days as I've seen in years. That was when I knew the HOA's days. And because while civil court might take months or years, federal investigations have a way of tightening like a vice. And once they started, there was no escape. So while Karen strutted around giving interviews, I sat back and let the machine grind forward, watching as subpoenas hit her bank accounts, as investigators showed up at her office, as whispers of indictment started to swirl. And all the while, the homeowners who had once praised her style, construction, they were left with nothing but half-finished shells of houses on land they didn't actually own. And when they realized their life savings had been poured into a fraud, they didn't blame me. They blamed Karen, flooding her with angry calls, showing up at her door demanding refunds. And I heard through the grapevine that she started traveling with private security just to feel safe, but security guards can't protect you from subpoenas. And security guards can't protect you from subpoenas. And with the seal of the federal government, the cracks in her composure began to show. Yet even then, she tried to bluff, calling me late one evening with a voice dripping with false confidence, saying, "We could make this go away if you just sit down and negotiate, maybe even take a cut of the profits." And I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the phone, because the arrogance of someone thinking they could buy off the man they had tried to rob was beyond the D. Beyond the D. "Karen, I don't want your money. I want your HOA gone. I want it burned to the ground so thoroughly no one will ever rebuild it." And the silence on the other end was sweeter than any settlement check could ever be, because in that silence, I knew she realized for the first time that she wasn't up against a victim, she was up against her executioner. And the execution wasn't going to be quick. It was going to be long, humiliating, and very, very public. Because just as I had planned, circling her like vultures, preparing to sue her and the HOA for their losses, which meant even if by some miracle she beat me, she would still drown in a tidal wave of lawsuits from her own people, and there was no saving her from that, no matter how loud she screamed. By the time winter crept across the farmland, frosting the empty frames of the half-finished homes that sat stranded on my property like abandoned skeletons. The storm I had unleashed was no longer mine to control. It had grown into something bigger, a full-blown legal and federal avalanche crashing down on Karen and her beloved HOA. And while I kept my head low and focused on tending my cabin, feeding the wood stove, and enjoying coffee on, non-coffee on, and enjoying coffee on, non-coffee on, non-coffee on, non-enjoying coffee on. Rightfully mine, Karen was sprinting between crisis after crisis, juggling civil lawsuits, federal investigators, furious homeowners, and investors baying for blood. And every week seemed to peel another layer off her polished exterior until she was left raw and desperate, though still clinging to her trademark arrogance like it was a life raft in a hurricane. But arrogance doesn't hold up against subpoenas. And by December, the FBI had onto the paper trail of fraudulent deeds that she and her cronies had passed around like counterfeit bills. And I'll never forget the day I drove past one of the developments where workers had long abandoned their posts, snow piled high against idle bulldozers, half-nailed beams creaked in the wind, and taped notices from the court flapped against plywood boards, each one a frozen reminder that the law had halted their little empire. And just as I had halted their little empire, and just as I pulled up in a rust-colored minivan, parents with weary faces unloading kids who stared wide-eyed at what should have been their dream home, but was now nothing more than a rotting husk. And the mother's eyes met mine with a mixture of grief and fury before she shouted, "You're the landowner, aren't you? Are we going to lose everything?" And though I wanted to reassure her, the truth was brutal, so I told her calmly, "You never owned this land to begin with. They lied to you. But if you join the lawsuits, you'll have a chance to get something back." And she nodded through tears, whispering that Karen had promised them security, a community, a future. And that was when I realized Karen's betrayal wasn't just about me or the land. It was a bad families who had staked their lives on her lies. And if my anger had needed more fuel, that moment poured gasoline on the fire. Because I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone she had trampled. So when the first federal indictment was handed down in January, charging Karen and 2 board members with wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy, I felt a grim satisfaction watching the news footage of her being her eyes darting like a cornered animal. Yet even then she had the gall to smirk at cameras, declaring the charges politically motivated, and claiming she would fight this witch hunt. But the mask was slipping, because behind the scenes, insiders were flipping like pancakes on a griddle. Her treasurer struck a deal. The secretary began cooperating. Even the shady lawyer who had drafted the forged deeds was singing to save his own skin. To save his own skin. The prosecutors had a mountain of evidence taller than the courthouse itself. But Karen, stubborn as ever, thought she could still claw her way out, so she began staging HOA meetings in private homes, rallying the remaining faithful, swearing that she'd sue me into bankruptcy, that she'd win in court, that she'd rebuild stronger than before. Yet as she spoke, recordings leaked out, and I sat by my fireplace, sipping whiskey while listening to her bravado, and I knew the walls were closing in. Because while she screamed about power and ownership, the investors had already pulled the plug, freezing funding, while banks began foreclosing on the few finished properties, leaving families trapped between mortgages and lawsuits. And meanwhile, my injunction remained firmly in place, with a judge recently expanding it to forbid any HOA action on my land or connected water rights. Essentially, any HOA action on my land or connected water rights. Decided to twist the knife. I mailed every homeowner a packet explaining not just the fraud, but the deeper truth that the HOA had never owned a single acre, that their dues had been funneled into Karen's personal accounts, and that as the rightful landowner, I had zero obligation to honor her contracts, which meant if they wanted a future, they needed to turn on her. In turn, they did, flooding her with demands, staging protests in front office walls, until she moved her meetings entirely online, hiding from the very people she once ruled over. But hiding couldn't save her from the law. And as spring thawed the fields, the federal case grew teeth. with the prosecutor filing a superseding indictment that added racketeering charges under RICO, which meant not just prison time but asset seizures. And the day Karen's accounts were frozen, I happened to be in town and saw her storming into her phone as cameras rolled, and I knew in that moment she was done. Because without money, her legal defense would crumble, her loyalists would scatter, and her empire would collapse. Yet the most satisfying part was knowing this wasn't my doing alone. I had only lit the match, but she had built the pyre with her own arrogance, and now she was the one burning atop it, while I, the landowner she had tried to erase, stood untouched, watching I am pie to erase, stood untouched, watching I am burning. Though I could have walked away then, content with her ruin, I wasn't finished, because I had promised her once that I wouldn't just beat her. I would erase the HOA so completely that no trace would remain. And Section 4 of my plan, as I called it, was now in motion, filing a countersuit for damages so massive it would make the HOA's bankruptcy inevitable. Because I wasn't just asking for the return of my land, I was demanding distress for every dollar they had stolen or cost me. And when my attorney tallied it, the number hit $48 million, a figure so staggering that Karen's new court-appointed lawyer nearly fainted reading it. And though I knew I wouldn't see every cent, I knew it guaranteed one thing. The HOA would never recover, never regroup, never rise from the ashes, and by the time the jury saw the evidence, the forgeries, the lies, the videos of forgeries, the lies, the videos of forgeries, the lies, the videos of who the villain was. And when the gavel finally came down, the name HOA would be a curse word in this county for generations. And Karen, stripped of everything, would be nothing more than a cautionary tale, a ghost haunting the ruins of houses that never should have been built on my land. When the final act of this saga unfolded, it wasn't in some dramatic standoff on my farmland, or during one of Karen's screaming HOA meetings, but in the cold, orderly chambers of the federal courthouse, a building of stone and glass where all her lies had finally been laid bare under fluorescent lights, where jurors had sat for weeks listening to testimony, poring over forged deeds, reading email chains riddled with arrogance, and watching food with arrogance, and watching food with arrogance, and watching food dragged into its last days. The weight of everything hung heavy in the room, like the air before a thunderstorm. And though Karen had once strutted in with tailored suits and smirks, by now she looked like a ghost of herself, her hair limp, her face drawn, her designer heels traded for scuffed shoes after the marshals seized most of her assets. And yet, even then, she tried to cling to her performance, glaring across the courtroom at me with a look that courtroom at me with a look that bang the courtroom at me with a look the courtroom at me with a look that cling perform. But arrogance doesn't sway juries, evidence does. And when the foreperson finally stood to read the verdict, guilty on all counts of wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, and even obstruction of justice, the sound that followed wasn't just the gavel striking, but the collective exhale of dozens of people whose lives she had twisted, homeowners, farmers, investors, neighbors, and even me, all of us bound by the damage she had received. Word guilty was repeated over and over, as though the syllables were chiseling away the last of her defenses, until she slumped back in her chair, no smirk left, no words left. Just a broken woman in shackles as the marshals led her out. And though I'm not the sort of man to celebrate another's ruin, I'd be lying if I said there wasn't satisfaction in watching justice finally reach her, because for months she had laughed at my warnings. For 3 months she had laughed at my warnings. She had laughed at my warnings. Warnings. 1 month she had laughed at my warnings. And now the system she had weaponized against others had devoured her whole. But my victory wasn't just personal, because when sentencing day came, the judge didn't just hand her a prison term. Though 22 years is a long time to sit behind bars, the judge also ordered full restitution, meaning every cent she had stolen would be clawed back through asset seizures and liquidation, and that included the HOA's accounts, the luxury cars, the luxury cars, Jewelry she flaunted at meetings, all gone, auctioned off, with proceeds funneled into a restitution pool for victims. And though the families wouldn't recover everything, they would get enough to restart, enough to know they hadn't been completely abandoned, and that mattered to me. Because while I had fought to protect my land, I had never forgotten the faces of those children staring at unfinished homes in the snow, their future stolen, and seeing a belief that maybe justice wasn't just about punishment, but about repair. But even as the courtroom saga ended, I still had one final card to play. My civil countersuit, which had been running parallel, and when the judgment came down in my favor, $48 million awarded in damages, trespass, fraud, and emotional distress. I knew the HOA was finished because no association, no matter how wealthy, can survive a blow like a blow like can survive a blow like a its board scattered, its name erased from county records, and just like that, the monster that had stalked me for years was gone. Not weakened, not wounded, but obliterated, reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered by lawyers and homeowners across the state. A lesson in what happens when greed blinds people to the truth of law and land. But the story didn't end there, because once the dust settled, I stood on my porch oaf. Porch oval bay. Houses still rotted in silence, and I realized I had a choice. I could leave them as monuments to Karen's failure, or I could turn the land back to what it was meant to be. And so I called in crews, not developers, but demolition experts. And over the course of months, I watched as those skeleton houses were torn down, hauled away piece by piece until the land was bare again, wide and open, the way my father had kept it. And once the last, and I'd keep the last, to Keene, fields stretching where once Karen had envisioned cul-de-sacs. And every summer when the stalks swayed golden under the sun, I felt peace again, knowing I had restored not just my rights but the land itself. Yet perhaps the greatest satisfaction wasn't in the fields or the verdict, but in the letters I began to receive. Families who had once cursed me now thanking me, neighbors writing to say they finally understood what I had been fighting for. Eva, of solidarity. And each letter reminded me that my battle had mattered, that it hadn't been just about me versus Karen, but about people versus corruption, about the truth versus lies. And though Karen will spend decades replaying her choices behind prison walls, I carry no more anger toward her, only the certainty that I outlasted her, that the law and the land stood on my side, and that no HOA, no fraud, no Karen could ever take that. With the